Well, for the fourth year in a row, Washington faces a $1 trillion deficit. Now, how much longer can this madness continue? I'm your guest host, Bill Whittle, sitting in for Alan Barton. Stand by for the front page. Well, joining me now in studio is Don Watkins, fellow at the Ayn Rand Center for Individual Rights, and Terry Jones, associate editor for Investors Business Daily. Gentlemen, we're going to get to the numbers here in a minute, and the numbers themselves are appalling enough. But before we get started, I would like to know, I'm sure a lot of people would like to know, no one in Washington has any idea of how these deficits ever work out for us in the future. No one's ever shown us how all of this deficit spending is eventually going to make the economy grow. No one's ever talked about how we're going to get back into something that looks like at least a balanced budget. Does anybody in Washington have a plan, Don? Does anybody have any idea what's going on here? Is there anything beyond the next year for these people?
Oh, well, I think certainly not. I mean, Terry can speak to the numbers, but the basic framework from which you have to think about an economy is that an economy runs on capital accumulation, on producing things and using that to produce more and more things. And that what debt in general does and what spending on consumption does, which is government spending is almost purely consumption, is it's draining the stock seed of the United States, our ability to produce, to make life better, to have the economy grow more and more, i.e. have our standards of living grow more and more. And that there's no concern with. They're not looking into the future because that would mean concern with how do people accumulate wealth and capital. Yeah, I'm convinced the people running the show in Washington don't have any clue about anything. Terry, again, we'll get to the numbers in just a second, but when people see these deficits and this debt piling on at this rate, this debt bomb, Americans are terrified of this. Is there any way out of this? I mean, you look at it, it just seems like it's an aneurysm that simply cannot be treated.
Yeah, and we were told, 4 years ago when President Obama came in that by now the deficits would be coming down very sharply. They, in fact, are not. They're going to hover over $1 trillion on average for the next 10 years with current policies in place. That would be a disaster of epic proportion. And what Don says here is absolutely correct. This is money. Every dollar that is spent by the government is a dollar that can't be spent by the private sector by definition. Private sector is where the productivity is. Right. So we're hurting future productivity, future income growth, future well-being and living standards by siphoning all this money off the private sector. But to your point, is there any way to control this? Daniel J. Mitchell of the Cato Institute did an interesting thought experiment. He took the numbers that the CBO put out and just said, okay, what if we just increased spending instead of by 3, 4, 5, 6% a year? What if we just increased it 2% a year? Increased it, not cut spending, increased it 2% a year. We are balanced in the budget within 10 years. All it would require would be a modicum of spending restraint. If the deficit is your sole goal, getting rid of the deficit, it would require a modicum of budget restraint. Unfortunately, that's not forthcoming from Washington.
No, addicts spend all the stuff there is. Let's get to the numbers. The CBO reported recently that the federal government faces a $1.079 trillion deficit for the 2012 fiscal year. They estimate that by 2017, simply servicing the debt will cost as much as paying for Medicaid. Terry, when are we going to hit the wall on this spending? This can't go on forever.
No, we can't. We're kind of fortunate right now, in a sense, because we have a Federal Reserve is officially running a zero interest rate policy, and essentially the federal government is borrowing money now for 10 years at 1.8%, which is next to nothing. That's less than inflation. So you're basically paying them for the use of, or paying them to take your money. It's an absurd situation. It's not going to last forever. Once interest rates, snap back to a reasonable approximation of normal, which would be around 5% for a 10-year interest rate, you're going to see interest costs explode overnight. They will double and quadruple virtually overnight. We'll go from spending about $250 billion a year to $750 billion a year. And it'll squeeze out a lot of other spending, and people will panic and wonder what's going on. This is what's going on, and this is the wages that must be paid to all this debt.
Don, these CBO numbers are the metric that we're talking about. Are CBO reports ironclad truth of what's actually happening out there?
I mean, in detail, no, but in essence, yes. I mean, in this case, there's no question that, as Terry's talked about, we have a fundamental problem which is government spending in general, but in particular entitlement spending, is unsustainable. And above all, Social Security and Medicare, there's no way to deal with that apart from cutting spending. Something's going to have to be done, because either you do that, or as Terry talked about, what you face is enormous, unsustainable, unbearable rises in interest rates. So, I mean, we're facing real problems, but then the question has to be what to do about them. Now, it would be, at this point, I would take 2%. You know, if they're going to do 2%, at least it buys you some time. Mm-hmm. But in terms of a real solution, you need to think more in terms of what should the government be doing. And in my view, what it should be doing is not confiscating our wealth and handing out to other people, but protecting our ability to earn wealth and use it to enjoy our lives. And if we actually got the government to return to that kind of core function that the founders assigned to it, then there's no longer a problem about, you know, did the CBO get the numbers exactly right?
Right, right. Well, Terry, this is 4 years of trillion-dollar deficits from a man who told us that this would all be under control. He talked about President Bush's $400 billion deficits as unpatriotic and unsustainable. And yet his approval ratings hovered around 44% last year. How do you explain this? And do you think the American people are turning the corner on this idea that President Obama is personally popular despite his spending policies?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, when you look at the numbers for how people perceive his economic performance, they're not nearly so rosy. And our own data with the IBD TIP poll show that more than half of all people think that it would be nice to have a new president, a different president. So I think Obama's not quite, even though his personal favorability numbers have remained fairly high, I think, you know, I don't think that that's going to last. And certainly, you know, we've got a modest improvement in the job market here in the last 4 or 5 months. They will try to you know, slipstream off that, draft off that. But the fact of the matter is, by the end of this year, we're still not going to be anywhere near where we should be. And if the Republicans are not brain dead, they should be able to make the case.
Well, Don, do you think that President Obama's, hey, nothing to see here, move along, lack of concern about this kind of spending, do you think that reflects something bigger about American culture in 2012, this idea that we enjoy taking things and we don't enjoy paying for things, and that the American people are just sort of going along because it's pleasant?
Well, I think that's certainly some of it. I mean, there's definitely an element of let's enjoy it while we've got it and not think past tomorrow. But I think what's harder to deal with and what's harder to fight is that there's a view on the other end of it of, well, we have a moral duty to take care of others. And so for things like Social Security and Medicare, there is an element of, well, I want a guaranteed income. But there is also, we have a duty to provide unearned incomes to other people. And when you have that moral premise trapped with kind of a short-term pseudo-self-interested motive, that's very hard to break. But what people need to challenge, I think, is this idea that government should be our brother's keeper, and challenge the idea that in your own life, you should be trying to get unearned benefits. We should go back to the way that America was, where people did not accept the unearned. I mean, even during the Great Depression, when Roosevelt was, you know, trying to do these giveaways, one of the reasons why they made it, much of it, public works, was precisely because, as Roosevelt recognized himself, Americans don't want to be on the dole. They don't want to accept handouts. And that's why they packaged Social Security the way they did as a so-called insurance program, is so that they could tell you, you've earned it. This is not a handout. So that is what really needs to be challenged and rethought today, I think.
Yeah, it's a philosophical argument. It's not an economic argument on this kind of scale. Yeah. Well, our beloved home state of California is feeling adverse effects of debt. It was recently reported that the Golden State will run out of cash by early March. That's just a month away, unless officials find another $3.3 billion. Terry, why does debt pose even more of a problem to the states than this gigantic federal monstrosity?
Well, because a state cannot print money. The federal government can, the state can, and the federal government has been printing money. If you've been paying attention to what the Fed's been doing, they've literally printed trillions of dollars in the last 4 years. But Jerry Brown does not have printing presses, and he has to borrow money in the capital markets. And the capital markets are very, very skittish these days, with Greece and Spain and Portugal and California all barreling in asking for more money, and all of them virtually bankrupt. And in our case, since so little progress has been made cutting spending and reducing the size of government, I think people are going to feel very, very wary of giving more money to the state of California under Jerry Brown, who wants to build a $100 billion bullet train.
Yeah, it's nuts. Don, final question for you. Obviously, a lot of people, I'm sure, in Sacramento assume that, well, if things get really, really bad, then the federal government will step in. They can't have the state of California go bankrupt. If California gets bailed out, why wouldn't every other state get bailed out? Are there any states that are showing the way to fiscal responsibility? Certainly, some states are doing much better than California. Should people just move to places that have some kind of sound financial footing?
Well, I mean, why don't California's political leaders move? Like, that would be
Hey,
much more ideal.
Yeah.
I don't want to leave. I like this. I like the weather. No, I don't think any state is an ideal model, but it's not very hard to be better than California. I mean, maybe like Michigan or something is vying for worst place.
Right.
Or, I mean, it's revealing that Terry was able to do a lineup that included Greece and California, because really it's a complete disaster here. And but the key thing is that Californians keep voting for it, and so there has to be a real change, not just in political leaders. Because I was joking, but if they left tomorrow, we'd elect a new group ready to do the same thing. Until people really change their idea about what government should be doing, not much to hope for here.
Yeah, there's some upper-level management positions available in North Korea, I hear. I think they'll be right at home. Thank you very much for joining us today, gentlemen. For Don and Terry, I'm Bill Whittle. You've been watching Front Page.